Hello everybody, welcome to Yuri's studio. I'm Erica Friedman, and here's where I answer questions I get online and at Yuri panels. And today we have two questions I'd like to answer. Both of them are from patrons. Thank you, Okazu Patrons, for making this video possible. And both of them are really interesting, but both of them also are as much about literature and writing and the way we read and understand things as they are about Yuri. So I wanted to address them both at the same time. I had done a live recording of this. It did not work, but thank you to everybody who came to that live recording. And this is take two. Today we're going to deal with two questions. The first question is, what is it with Yuri and vampires? And the second question is, why is Yuri always a romance story? I think these are two great questions, and we'll deal with them today on Yuri Studio. So our first question today is from one of our patrons, Christian, and he asks, what is it with Yuri and vampires anyway? And the answer is, there's a single word answer to that, and then there's a complex answer to that. So let's get on with the single word answer to that. The answer to that is Carmilla. In 1872, 25 years before Dracula, Sheridan Fanu serialized a story called Carmilla. It was written originally in The Dark Blue, which was a literary magazine in London. And it is a very gothic horror story. In fact, it's so typical in gothic horror that it's almost impossible to read a little bit. It has a lot of the kinds of things we expect from Victorian stories, like it was a letter written by somebody to somebody else about somebody else's story, or a diary somebody else found, this kind of third-party thing. But it's all those things. It has gormless villagers who make the sign of the cross a lot. We have lots of gothic horror things. There's transformations into animals. There's a lot of the trappings of vampire content for years to come, like being put off by Christian liturgy, that kind of thing. It also adds something that I really want to address eventually. It's the single most fearful and titillating thing for most adult men, which is young women's pubescence. It's a terrifying thing. It's also super titillating, and they're kind of obsessed by it, which is the entirety of why moe is so popular. It is literally the budding of young women. And so that and a frisson of lesbianism gives us a perfect breeding ground for Yuri vampires. So that's the short answer, is Carmilla exists, and therefore vampires and Yuri. But there's a longer answer, and I want to address that just a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about queer coding villainy. There's been a lot of writing recently about how Disney queer codes, or intentionally or unintentionally queer codes villains, but also how people read villains as queer coded, whether they are intentionally done so or not. And why? And that's because they are othered. Villains don't follow the rules. They subvert the rules. They transform the rules. They do things that are outside the rules and against the rules all the time. They are the embodiment of the other. Obviously, for folks who are queer, that is the world we inhabit. Therefore, we're watching people who are not accepted, who are not mainstreamed, who do what they want to do the way they want to do it as queer-coded, whether or not they're intentionally done so. And nowadays, a lot of them are, in fact, intentionally done so. I'm going to suggest we all watch Loki. The Loki series intentionally queer codes Loki, which is 100% canon because he was everything sexual in the original Norse canon. He had sex with objects and animals and people of any gender, and that's just totally in character for him. So him being bisexual in the Disney version is totally on point. So when you have romance and other sex and sexuality all being taboo or different or outside the norm, it's going to be kind of obvious that villainy and sex and sexuality are all bound together. The original Dracula, of course, does have the character as a sexualized character, and that's really on point for a lot of writing. Any character that is in fact sensual or sexual is considered demonic. And that's straight to us from the Middle Ages, where all sex was demonized, and so it's very normal. So what you have is Carmilla, this apparently young woman who is coming on to another young woman, and she can transform into animals, and there's all sorts of weirdness about the way she can't handle Christian liturgy, and Laura is both attracted and repulsed. It is a perfect scenario for othered sexuality and for us to read it and go, oh yeah, we need more lesbian vampires. So there are actually a lot of versions of Carmilla out there. There's some very bad ones. In anime, I believe there's at least one Carmilla. In Vampire Hunter D's world, there's a Carmilla. I know that there are lots of B-rank movies of many different kinds. And there is, of course, the web series on YouTube, Carmilla, which I think did a really excellent job. I'm going to say flat out, it did a lovely job of sort of combining the Carmilla world, a little Lovecraftian stuff, and a little bit of Night Vale sort of content. And it made a really fun and creepy, but fun creepy and creepy series. So if you have not watched it, I heartily recommend it. And also, if you have not yet read Fanu's Carmilla, it is available for free, out of copyright, on Gutenberg.org. I will put links in the show notes, and I highly, highly recommend you watch it. So that is my answer to why do we have so many Yuri vampires, is Carmilla othering, queer-coding villains, and lesbians. And there you have it. It's a perfect mix for vampires. So there we go. That's question number 1. For question number 2 today, we have a question that I get all the time. It came to me through a couple patrons. I've gotten it online, I've gotten it on panels, and I wanted to address it because it's really complicated and it's interesting because it's complicated. Today's second question is, why is Yuri always romance? So let's begin at the beginning. Labels do 2 things simultaneously that are actually at odds with one another. We label ourselves so we can define ourselves to both ourselves and other people, if that makes sense. So I might say I'm queer, and that identifies me as not straight, maybe not cisgender, maybe fluid, who knows, to somebody who doesn't necessarily know me personally. It gives them a not mainstream, not hetero, not cis label, okay? That's to some extent both for me and for other people. Also, it allows me to identify my art. If I say this is queer commentary, now people can say, oh, is a genre that is not heteronormative or cisnormative. And now you know that going into it, what my commentary is going to be. At the same time, labels function as the opposite thing. It's a way for people who are not us to label us. Oh, that queer. Now, yes, any word can become a slur if you say it with derision. If I call you or myself a weeb, for instance, which I don't, I hate that word, I consider it a slur term. If I were to say, oh, I'm just a weeb, I'm dismissing myself. But if you were to look at me and go, oh, you're just a weeb, that's meant as a slur. Do you understand that? So we have a function of labels that helps define us for ourselves, and a function of labels that helps other us for other people. Sometimes, of course, they're including us. Oh, you're queer too. But in a lot of cases, people use labels to other people. You're not one of us, you're one of them. So this is the thing that labels do to sort of other. It's just like in literature, we say something is a sports story. Now, maybe the story isn't really about sports. Maybe it's using sports to tell a larger story, a story about, I don't know, social justice or love or some other thing. But the story is focused around a sport, therefore it's a sports story. Why do we call it that? So I can go into a store and go, oh, it's that sports story with the 2 girls that just came out last week. And then the people who are talking with me will understand what label I'm using. So labels have multiple functions. We call stuff romance to identify that that is one of the main themes. But here's where it gets really complicated. What if I were to tell you, I saw a series on television and one of the characters said, oh, I like pretty girls. And you go, oh, that's a queer story. No, It's a K-drama, and it's a mystery. It's not really a romance at all. There's no romance in it, and none of the characters are, as far as we can tell, queer. The character was saying that as a throwaway line to piss somebody else off. And it was a great line, don't get me wrong, she's a great character. But the point is that a romance story just because they say that? Is that a queer story just because they say a thing? No. We look at the story and we say, it's a mystery, it's a suspense story, it's a police procedural, which it isn't. These are the ways we label that particular series. So let's take a Yuri manga that I recently reviewed, SHWD Should by sono.N. It's an action story. We have these kind of yucky, gross, unidentifiable things. We have an all-female team that we are told explicitly are all gay. And in the first volume, none of them are romantically inclined with each other. They're just, we know that there are characters who are gay. And we know it's a Yuri story because we are told it's a Yuri story. But in that first series, all they do is fight. Is it an action story? Is it a Yuri story? Do we need proof of one of the characters being romantically inclined with somebody to prove to us that it's Yuri? I'm not saying we do. I'm just saying it's something to think about. In my first season, I did a video called What Makes a Story Yuri? And the answer was you. You make a story Yuri by your intent, by your perception of the story. If I hand you a story in which all of the characters are said to be gay, but you don't see them romancing anybody, there's no romance at all in the story, it's simply an action story, is that in fact in your head a Yuri story? Do you understand my point? You would have to decide, the characters being queer, is that enough for you to think that is a queer story? Or do you want some romantic involvement, or even just a hint that flashback with a previous relationship or something? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Early lesbian mysteries all had characters who previously had lovers. They either broke up or one of them died, you know, hand of God writing. And later on in the story, they fall for somebody else. So it's a lesbian mystery. But if that never happened, is it still a lesbian mystery? And only you can decide. So why is Yuri romance? Let's go back to the phrase I just used, hand of God writing. Hand of God writing is my shorthand for stories that do something huge and traumatic to create the narrative, to create the conflict. For instance, think about a lot of fanfic where you have two characters who are canon together and one of the writers doesn't like that, so they kill off one of the characters, pair him up with somebody else, and that's the new story. It's hand of God. It's, you know, something crushing the narrative. Hand of God writing is major disruption to the narrative. Now, think of what causes disruption in a life. In an adult life, changing jobs, relationships beginning, relationships ending, moving, children. Those are your major sort of life changes that become massive disruptions. In a young life, most of those things are kind of minimized. Maybe they move, start a new school rather than a job, new relationships beginning and ending. So romance is a major disruptive force in a life and therefore becomes a very easy way to force a narrative. So why is there so much romance? Because it's an easy, low-hanging fruit. There's a lot more Yuri right now that is, in fact, not just straight up school stories or just straight up romance stories. We have a lot of office stories. We have a lot more adult life stories, which broadens out the opportunities. There's action like Otherside Picnic and Should. So you've got more variety these days. But if you think about it, so much of what we have is really based around romance, not just in Yuri, but in all other kinds of stories. So it's not really all that unusual. So hopefully that explains why we have so many Yuri vampires these days, explains why so much of Yuri is romance. And I just want to remind you before we end up that Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a vampire lesbian romance story set in school. So we're used to it. That's also, it's a big seller. That's why. That's the third answer is it sells. And that's why. So thank you all very much for joining me today in my little short 2-question video. I want to thank all my Okazu patrons for their questions. If you become an Okazu patron, I have an open thread for patrons where you can ask me questions that I will turn into Yuri Studio videos. I hope you will become an Okazu patron and help us support all of our Yuri research, our journalism, our guest reviews, and help creators directly, Yuri content creators directly. All of that goes a really long way. Even $5 a month makes a huge help. So please consider joining our Patreon. Also, like everyone else, I'd like you to consider to click like on this video on YouTube and also subscribe to our channel. All of that makes a big difference. And I want to thank you very much for joining me once again. I'll see you next time on Yuri Studio.